All right, folks, welcome to this week's webinar, The Financial State of the Union, What's Ahead, with my guest, Professor Jamie Hopkins, co-director of the American College New York Life Center of Retirement Income, for Retirement Income, and a good personal friend. Jamie, take it away. It's all yours.
Don, thank you for having me, and thank RFS also, I guess, for helping sponsor this and get it going. What I'm going to be covering today is just a whole bunch of different topics that are all kind of related to the financial state of the United States. Where are we today? Kind of what's coming down the pipeline? Maybe what's not real high priority. What are we not going to expect to see anytime soon? And we've kind of just got a general outline of the things I'm going to try to cover here. And this list always changes for me, kind of the flavor of the month, what I want to talk about, what I don't want to talk about. I'll just give you a brief introduction to myself, the American College, what we do here, just a minute or two. Then we will jump into kind of the State of the Union. Now, as you see on there, I have retirement planning 2017. Because that's my focus, I tend to stick to retirement or at least financial services related topics. I don't get into kind of policy decisions that don't relate to finances directly. Now, obviously, most decisions have an impact on finances, social, foreign, etc. But I really try to stay out of that aspect in my presentation. So what we're looking at today is I usually start off with interest rates because they drive so much of what happens in the world today. It's a hugely important topic, even though there's not always a lot to decide on that. It is what it is today. We'll talk a little bit about tax reform as we're kind of hearing that in some ways maybe move up to the top of the decision-making tree down in D.C. lately. Healthcare, which was the hot topic earlier in the year, starting to fall down the list right now. Then we get into some of the other ones that are really in my specialty area, Social Security, the fiduciary rules that are out there. And I do say rules, plural. Most of you are probably familiar with the conversations about one, but it really is a multitude of different rules. We'll talk about estate planning, what's kind of happening there. That's one of my key expertise areas. Being an attorney, LLM, have practiced some in the estate planning world. I can provide a lot of guidance there. And then the last one was one of my favorite things out there, the MIRA. I was a big supporter of it, so much so that the Department of Treasury actually had me up on their website talking about their own program, which I liked, and now that's being sunsetted. So I guess I'm probably not still up on the website. I've probably been scrubbed off of it, and then so that's sad for me. I'm no longer up there. But then the state IRA programs, what's going to be happening there, and then if we have time, we'll kind of conclude with some thoughts. But it is a lot of stuff to cover. First thing about the American College of Financial Services, we've been around for 90 years now. We're not new. We've been doing this since 1927 and really came from the Wharton program at UPenn, one of the most prestigious schools in the country programs. And we were the insurance department there, then branched off and became, kind of a standalone institution to educate financial service professionals, raise the level of professionalism in the industry. What our numbers say, we've educated 1 in 5 financial advisors across the United States. So a pretty big impact there. We have a pretty big reach still. Our main programs, CFP, CLU, CHFC, and the Retirement Income Certified Professional, which actually Don Graves is a graduate of. I believe Dan Holquist at Reverse Vision, who might be on the call today too, also a graduate. So we do have some RICPs out there now, even in the reverse field, that learned a little bit more about retirement education. We have a PhD, master's. We're an accredited college. We go through accreditation, same as Villanova, UPenn, Princeton, all those institutions. And we are a 501c3 nonprofit. As Don said, there's a little picture of me, so you at least put a face, to the name and voice. Might have not matched up, and I'm sorry if it doesn't. Sorry to disappoint, but that is what I look like. This is just kind of a promo slide for the college. I'm not going to spend any more time on that one. The RICP is always in my slide decks because I'm one of the two program chairs of that education program. I love it, all about retirement income planning. We do cover reverse mortgages, housing wealth, fairly solid program. Trying to keep it up to date, so we'll be updating it probably soon with the new regulations about reverse mortgages, even though I won't be covering that in this presentation. But as actually I mentioned, Dan Holquist just did a fantastic presentation on that yesterday from Reverse Vision. I believe he has a recording of that, so you can always reach out or find that probably online too and watch it. So where are we today? Well, we have still what I would say is a new administration. Still filling roles. I think we just saw Trump announce somebody for the FHA earlier today. So, things are constantly changing out there. And so new administration means what? It means new uncertainties, right? That's really true of every single administration out there. I've been using this slide for a number of years. You can change the administration and you get the same thing. New uncertainties, right? Somebody's been now voted into office to change what you've been doing. You have a change. And so that's what we're experiencing now from a political standpoint is some change going on. And that creates uncertainties. We're not going to do things exactly like how we've done them in the past. And again, that can be good and bad. And so at least I'm going to start off with the good news, right? So what's the good news right now? Well, we do have uncertainty out there. Some things are going very well for the country right now. Unemployment has been dropping now for many years. Now, this is always an interesting thing. There's kind of the unemployment rate, which usually gets most of the focus, which is actually has been pretty consistently measured now since the mid-90s, I think was the last real change to the way that we measure that. There's also another measurement you can look at, kind of work, kind of everyone who's not working, which is a little bit different than the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate kind of looks at this people who are actively looking for work, but that's very low. Now, we have had a move to have less people involved in the workforce. A lot of that has to do with demographics, an aging population, more people being in college, and so that's actually pulled more people out of the workforce, but our unemployment rate is fairly low, has been low for a number of years now, since we started recovering from kind of the 2008 and aftermath. And it is probably going to stay low for at least the near term. Most companies seem fairly secure in the sense of cash holdings, profits, and so when companies start spending more, they don't have as much cash. We could see some more risk there, but that seems fairly stable right now. Stock markets, right, are reaching all-time highs. I think it was yesterday, we had all three, the Dow, S&P, and NASDAQ, all hit, highs on the same day. So they're up there now, 22,000 for the Dow. And if these numbers don't always necessarily mean anything to people, but they're high, right? They're up, and so that's good news. Especially for investors, that's good. It's good news for companies. That now there's some arguments out there whether or not the things are overvalued, undervalued. Our president here at the American College, Dr. Bob Johnson, who worked with the CFA Institute for a long time, has an investment book that Warren Buffett, I think, is on Warren Buffett's must-read investment book list. Bob actually is of the opinion that the stock market is not overvalued, probably still undervalued comparable to other investments. So while no one person is always correct, at least it's comforting to me to hear somebody say, we're not experiencing kind of this bubble and about crash yet. The other thing here, and this one's kind of mixed, and that's why I kind of ended on my good news, is inflation rates remain low. Now, that does have mixed benefits. There are some positive aspects of inflation, but there are some negative aspects too, kind of depending on who you're looking at. For most seniors that are living on fixed income, low inflation is probably a good thing for you. That's going to keep the cost of goods and the decline in your purchasing power a little bit lower over time. But again, that one really is kind of mixed. You have both sides of that coin, whether or not that's a positive or a negative. So then what's some of the bad news? What are some of the concerns, right? And I list kind of concerns, bad news. Now, some of these are the real bad news, and some of them are maybe just concerns. They're going to become bad news. Obviously, what we've been hearing more and more about is kind of the debt limit. We had a little bit of an agreement to postpone some of the real decision making so we could get some funding for the devastation that occurred by the two recent hurricanes. So, all of our thoughts, prayers, and best wishes, and then hopefully more than just that, but out to those in Houston, Texas area, Florida, the Caribbean, the island nations out there. A lot of people really struggling, and that's going to have lasting ramifications. But at least some funding was approved there. Now our debt discussion, our budget for the government moving forward, we're still pretty much operating under the Obama administration's proposals there. We haven't really moved to a new administration yet. And it's possible, I think I saw the Bipartisan Policy Center said, probably not, they're actually not in the government, but there are feelings where I think maybe until next year now before we really get that all agreed to at least a kind of lasting proposal. So that's going to be something to watch out for. It's kind of a looming issue, and it's going to be taking up a lot of time. Healthcare concerns would have been on the top of this list. You go back 6 months ago. And at this point, it's starting to fall down the list. I might even flip it from the tax issue very soon. Complicated tax process is probably following that up, that the government would love to have 2018 start with a new tax bill in place. But the idea of having full tax reform doesn't seem real likely anymore. Tax cuts mixed with budget cuts seems more likely than a full tax process overhaul. So I think kind of the hope for that, to have that in play by the end of the year, doesn't seem real certain anymore. But again, I think almost everyone out there in the country wants some tax process overhaul in the United States. It's just too burdensome. So we are going to take a couple looks at that. What are some of the proposals? There are some plans floating around D.C. For kind of a tax overhaul. But I just don't know any of them have enough traction to actually get through, both parts of Congress through the president and into law. I think if something gets to the president, it's going to be signed into law, but I don't see anything getting there right now from a total process standpoint. And then two other ones that are kind of budding issues, but are still a couple years away from being kind of the major bad news issue. We know long-term care concerns. Back actually when the Affordable Care Act was passed, there were serious concerns about long-term care. The Affordable Care Act actually had some provisions about overhauling and adding some federal insurance for long-term care situations. Ended up being passed and then eventually pulled out of the bill a couple years ago, so that was kind of removed. But that's still a big concern. They had a long-term federal care commission a couple years ago that put in some recommendations, but really nothing's moved there. Now, we are still we're probably still a decade away from kind of a big major issue there, but that's not a real long time. And then obviously Social Security funding is kind of looming. Now, I'm going to cover that, kind of what the most recent this summer's 2016 trustee report came out with, and not all that different from last year's trustee report. So the first part here, just interest rates. This is, always important here. Now, if you kind of look, as I said, what's kind of happening is that there's kind of discussions every day, articles every day. What's the Federal Reserve going to do next? Are they going to raise again for, this year? And that seems mixed now. I said, and some of these things likely to see a small rate increase sometime soon again. And now, again, what does that mean in 6 months? Maybe during that time frame, I would expect to see another bump. The debt, they kind of said, we're not going to start unloading debt until we probably get up to around 2%. So probably in the next 2 years, they'd probably like to get there, or maybe a year and a half up to 2%. Now, those are, as I said, the rates are going to be really small, right? We moved in March from 0.75% to 1%, and this summer from 1 to 1.25. These are pretty, small rates still, right? This is really low. Now, what's the positives for this? Well, again, the positive is this does make borrowing a lot easier. It makes borrowing fairly cheap. So there's a lot of easy money to get access to today. But it also means that for, kind of safe investors, for conservative investors that are kind of afraid of the market, especially where, kind of the market is today, there's not a whole lot of great options for them out there. You really can't live off of interest only from CDs and bonds. I was looking at CD and bond rates for somebody for 5 years, and I was like, man, I can't see telling anyone to use that as a safe investment right now. It's just the returns are so low. It's that's scary to me too. So that's a real concern. Again, I love looking at charts. Now, again, you can probably modify a chart to make it look like almost anything you want if you just pulled, right, kind of 2010 to 2017 in one chart. You'd say, man, rates are just skyrocketing, right? If you showed percentage increases, because that's a pretty big percentage increase. When you go from a 0.5% to 0.75, that's a big percentage increase, right? It's actually much larger than most of the other increases as a percentage of the rate that you've seen historically. And there are some, there's some research out there that actually says it's not so much the rate that you care about, but it's the movement of the rate that impacts stock markets, returns, and the economy. That, rising rates or falling rates is really what's important, not the actual rate amount. And so there is some debate about that. But as you can see, right, when we're talking about a rate increase today, and we're kind of all the way over now on that little extra piece that's out there. We saw this summer raised to 1.25. But look at that compared, kind of going back to 1975. We're basically still at, what equates to an all-time low if you remove the last decade from this. Right, when we used to early 80s have 18% CDs out there, investing for income and just living off your yields or returns was really easy. Today, that's almost impossible to do at a 1.25. And also, if you kind of flip this and look at the stock market here, right, you'd see tremendous growth from 2000, or a little bit after kind of 2010 here until today. And it's pretty much been on a consistent trajectory now for a number of years, the stock market, and hasn't kind of broken from that trajectory yet. Not sure how much is going to keep going, but still kind of meeting that trajectory. But that's impacting, right, reverse mortgages, car loans. It's going to be impacting, housing rates, all those things, and then eventually housing prices and car prices. It will have a big impact on that. Now, while that's kind of the macro world there, what's kind of happening in a little bit kind of specific areas? So one of them is tax reform. And what I said before, almost everyone agrees that we want tax reform. The current system is really, really challenging. The current system also is piecemeal, right? It's patchwork. It's not a cohesive system anymore. That we support public policies that don't make sense anymore. And actually, one of the biggest issues I have with the kind of current tax system is the issue of kind of capital gains and earned income. And actually, our system supports capital gains. It supports not working, right? That really the best way to be in this world is to own something, right? To be invested in something and not actually to work. We really should encourage people to work, actually tax that lower and maybe tax investments higher. But, that's been set for a number of years now, but it hasn't always been the case. We do, it says we do have a high corporate kind of rate, but we actually don't have one of the highest income from corporate taxes. So it's actually, our effective rate, what we actually get from corporations is actually lower than the average top 30 economic countries. So when a lot of people say, oh, the United States, we have a high corporate tax rate, we're driving away business, we actually look, there's a lot of very profitable companies that have not paid taxes in the U.S. for years, driving down the effective rate. And again, that's mostly public policy decisions we made, tax breaks, credits here and there, and sometimes really just for specific companies and very large companies. And so some of that needs to change too, right? Where we have a more even and fair system. And that's probably one of the issues today, as I said, because it's so patchwork, our system, that it really is an unfair system today. It's not really supporting all of the public policy and business growth that we want. And then for individuals, the individual tax return, you basically need to hire somebody, use a program. It's very hard to do it yourself. Uh, Now, I know a lot of people use TurboTax again, but you're kind of hiring somebody in that sense, low cost in the grand scheme of things because it's been scalable. I like TurboTax. I think it's a very nice software program and very helpful. But, and someone like them probably is not a big fan of a big or simplification of the tax code. And when we look at the potential changes, right, Trump a year ago was running on simplifying the tax code. People even talked about making it a one-page document. But tax reform will be incredibly challenging. And one of the reasons I always say this is, when you look at how challenging healthcare reform has been. Now, obviously, healthcare reform impacts a lot of people. But if you really look at the Affordable Care Act, while it does impact employer sponsored health care, the majority of the impact is actually the non-employer health care plans. It's the individuals out there that have health care. That's a much smaller group than the group that's impacted by tax reform, right? Almost everyone in the country is impacted by tax reform. And, from top to bottom, tax reform is going to impact you. So there's a lot of players in this market. So it's going to be very hard to get tax reform done. Now, does that mean that there's not going to be tax changes? No, I would expect some tax changes by the end of the year. I can't imagine. I guess I can imagine it, but I know that what's going on down in D.C. right now, there are some tax cuts and some budget cuts that are really high priority and one in. Now, what are some of the, from Trump and some of the proposed cuts out there? Be to simplify the individual tax rates down to 12, 25, 33%, and really cut down the corporate rate from kind of 35% down to 15 to 20%, depending on who you're looking at, and actually cut out some deductions. So it's not impossible, actually, if you move the corporate rate down and got rid of a lot of the credits and deductions, you actually could possibly increase the effective tax rate here in the United States from corporations, so they actually be paying more taxes with a simpler system. That's not impossible. But from historically, true tax cuts where have never paid for themselves. And what do I mean by that? It means that the government, historically in the U.S., we have no data showing that by making tax cuts, the government's going to bring in more income through spurred economy. Now, it is true that cutting taxes can spur the economy. Though it doesn't always, but it definitely can, right? The people can invest more, they can grow more. But that growth has never offset the loss in revenue. So what does that mean? It means that any tax cut really does need to come with budget cuts. And I think that's where things get a little bit tougher. What else are you going to cut? We've also seen some discussion about removing the mortgage interest and charitable deductions for tax purposes. Both of those were cuts in Trump's plan. And as we said, those were always kind of the sacred cows of the tax world, that mortgage interest deduction. But are we encouraging people who can't afford to buy homes to buy because they get some deduction? Do most charitable contributions continue to occur even without a deduction? Again, that's those are kind of philosophical debates. But as we see home ownership rates start to drop today, it does kind of beg the question, should we remove an incentive for people to buy a home, which definitely the mortgage interest deduction does encourage that. But what do we do with that? And then if we do have cuts without, if we do have tax breaks, tax cuts without budget cuts, what are the consequences? Can we allow our debt? Can we just keep spending more than we have been? I don't think anyone wants that either. Do we have to be harder on some other areas, right? Do we have to make Social Security cuts, Medicare cuts, infrastructure cuts? What about all the student loan programs out there that are being funded or subsidized by federal money? What happens to those? And, there's been some concern already that some of those programs are on shaky ground, that the Department of Education's already been saying that maybe you shouldn't rely on some of these programs, and we're not sure if we're actually going to follow through with them. Scary point. And again, tax reform or tax cuts. What I think we're going to see is more tax cuts. Tax reform's hard, and at this point, really almost impossible without an agreement from both sides to get a full tax reform. So we're not seeing a whole lot of working together in D.C. Right now, so it's going to be hard to get that passed. But tax cuts can be passed at this point today. The Trump administration also, they released like a one-pager about tax reform. Realistically, what they said are here are some general principles, but Congress, we'd like you to figure out the actual plan, which Congress has been working on. And there's also tax policy centers out there working on this too. But it doesn't look like we're going to get a detailed plan from the actual Trump administration. Looks like the plan is going to come from elsewhere if a reform plan does show up. But at this point, we're probably waiting till next year at best to see a reform plan, maybe tax cuts by the end of the year. Healthcare reform, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on right now. This has been a little bit kind of pushed to the back right now. Again, it could pop back up as hot conversation, but all the kind of proposed existing changes that anyone had on their mind has come up and not been approved. So we're kind of stuck there. But we're getting to the point, the Affordable Care Act, whether you like it or don't like it, doesn't really matter. Changes are needed. Like it needs updates, it needs fixes, or you need to come up with a different system. But kind of the status quo isn't going to work here. So that's an important thing. The problem here, again, has been really kind of a lack of working together on both sides to come up with something that works for the American people. It seems to be kind of one-off policies as opposed to a system. That's dangerous because we have a system now that's not going to continue to function properly. And as we saw last year, right, some of the rate hikes in specific areas. We see some challenges with the individual marketplaces for the Affordable Care Act. Now, the Affordable Care Act is kind of a whole big law, which includes more than just the insurance-specific marketplace aspects. And it also includes a bunch of taxes that were added to drive certain public policy things, actually adding a tax to kind of dissuade or at least tap into that investment growth. And that's probably, again, one that makes sense, but will that go at some point? We could see a cut there. But again, right now, not a whole lot of movement in that world. I did say the long-term care world is also an issue. That was a big issue when the Affordable Care Act was originally passed. I haven't heard a whole lot of discussion about this again, but we know it's a budding issue. And the main reason that this is going to be an issue is because in the United States today, what do we rely on? We rely on family members to provide the care. That's the majority of our long-term care system. And we basically, over kind of to 2030, we're going to lose more than half of our family caregivers per person who needs care. And that's because we have an aging society. And so all of a sudden, we're going to have this stress on the American caregiver that we haven't seen before. It's always been challenging, but it's going to get really tough. And we might see more and more people on things like Medicaid. And then we don't want to have a higher budget for Medicaid. Almost no state does. The government doesn't want to. But long-term care insurance has been unable to fill the gap. It's an expensive product in the sense of actual dollars, right? Not a lot of people can afford it. Or at least the current way that most people approach selling it, buying it, it's small market penetration. You can come up with some affordable products, but the long-term care insurance market struggled a little bit, right? We actually saw Genworth, which was one of the biggest players there, leave the business. They're gone. They're out of it. But what we've seen filling in there in the marketplace are hybrid products. And these are life insurance products, annuity products mixed with a long-term care benefit rider. And we actually have seen some states add, a reverse mortgage-like home equity product that has a long-term care benefit to it. I think Connecticut has one of those. And so those are some interesting things. But as again, I said, not a top priority this year. It is a budding issue out there, but we have very little real discussions in D.C. about any comprehensive long-term care solution moving forward. Now, one of the ones I spend entirely too much time on every single day for years now has been the Department of Labor expansion of the ERISA standards of care, conflict of interest rule, which we normally just refer to as the fiduciary rule. But as I said earlier in this presentation, that's actually too simple. There are multiple fiduciary rules out there. There's really, in some sense, multiple versions of a fiduciary role, even under ERISA, different requirements for different people. But there are some general guidelines here that we need to know about. So this has been, this is an incredibly important topic for the financial services industry, and really anyone who provides advice to potential clients or consumers. So kind of what happened and where are we? So we've actually now had a rule change from the Department of Labor. So an administration procedure, new rule that's all under ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act 1974, was passed a year and a half ago at this point, April of 2016, became law back in the June of 2016. First implementation date was set for April 2017. As a new administration took over, uncertainty rose, right? Trump came out against the rule in kind of a memorandum, which originally looked like it was going to be an executive order, said Department of Labor, fix this thing, get rid of it, whatever you need to do. The only thing they could do initially was push off the initial implementation date by a little bit. That moved to June. Now we actually technically have an expanded rule in place. But a lot of the real teeth of the rule, the enforcement aspects of it, the lawsuits, the contracts that need to be signed, that was all set for January 1, 2018. It was kind of the first day of implementation. You had to have it done by this year. Right now, we're just about wrapping up, maybe another couple weeks, month, before the DOL officially delays that second implementation date. But there aren't a whole lot of hurdles left for them to jump at this point to delay that. They already sent their proposal through the OMB. It went through. They're in the notice and comment period. I think now they're almost wrapped this up. So what we're going to see is a delay of that for a year and a half. Why is that important? Well, during that time, it's really going to be what I say dethorned, defunded. It's going to be kind of stripped down. I don't think we're going to see much more than what we have today, which is kind of in name and expanded explanation of what is advice, what's investment advice under the rule. But I don't think we're going to see the class action lawsuit, and I really don't think we'll ever see anyone sign the best interest contract exemption, which was really a contract that made you kind of liable for a bunch of different things. I don't think those are going to happen. I think that's really what we're going to see pulled. But we have already seen changes. As I said, we were supposed to have date one was at April 10th. That actually ended up getting pushed to June, but that went through. We now are acting under the impartial conduct best interest standard, supposed to be receiving reasonable compensation. And we saw significant changes there. We saw changes to mutual funds, insurance products, fees. So it did have almost an immediate impact on some fees. It also definitely required more documentation. In some sense, that might always be the biggest change of regulations is document, document, document. We saw that. Now, again, the January 1, it doesn't even really matter at this point, like what's going to be occurring then, because that's not going to be the rule we're going to get. It's going to be different by the time that 18-month delay is over. Now, as I said, what else is happening? There are still lawsuits ongoing about this. There was some movement in Congress to actually scrap the whole expanded rule, but at this point, it doesn't look like anything can get passed. A lot of companies have just started moving forward with training and compliance to act as under this best interest standard. We did see a bunch of new flat fee or level fee is probably the best way to describe them, indexed and variable annuities. We've seen changes to different mutual fund shares to bring down the costs. As we said, Trump did jump into the ring, and he's made some comments about it. But at this point, he's kind of left this alone to the Department of Labor, and the Department of Labor is actually appropriately dealing with this in the way that an administration and regulatory body should. They're doing the right things. They're listening. They're going to go through the process and make changes. So that's all very encouraging from just a process standpoint. But we've also seen now, and this is something to pay very close attention to that a lot of you might not be aware of, that states are now passing their own fiduciary rules. I've been meaning to write kind of a more comprehensive article on this coming up, and hopefully I'll get to that in the next couple of weeks, but I've been saying that for about a month now, is what the implications of these are going to be. And I say this is important for anyone in kind of financial that might have what you would deem as a client or consumer when you're talking about money. If these things are drafted to be kind of broad, that you have a really kind of aggressive statute that's passed, they could really cover a lot of people, kind of maybe undesigned to do so. But we've seen that before where, somebody goes and passes something and then all of a sudden it's impacting a lot more people than it might. And so that's something to be paying close attention to as states say, hey, if the federal government's not going to regulate financial advice more comprehensively, we are going to at the state level. Now, they might be kind of unable to regulate certain things, like the states really can't regulate advice inside of ERISA. I believe they're preempted from doing that by ERISA, and the fact that there is a Department of Labor and federal law on this, states probably can't, but they can regulate a lot of areas, and especially as you hold yourself out. But again, here, uncertainty kind of remains king here in the DOL world. We're going to see continued changes to this rule during the expansion of the kind of the delay of the rule, and we're probably going to see that expansion pulled back a little bit. Now, one thing I've been covering a lot lately is just this idea of what is advice under ERISA. And what you could see here is that this can cover a lot more people than just financial advisors. And so I actually pulled the language here just to show people what it is. Recommendations with respect to rollovers, transfers, or distributions from a plan or IRA, including whether, in what amount, what form, and to what destination a rollover, transfer, or distribution should be made. Now, one of the kind of interesting things about this is the distributions. And if all of a sudden you're providing any type of recommendation about how money should be spent from an IRA, that's deemed as investment advice under ERISA about, and then you're a fiduciary, essentially. And so that's a very scary prospect. It's really the first time in our history that you could be an investment advisor providing investment advice under ERISA where you're providing no specific recommendations about an investment. Just you're actually providing kind of recommendations about how you should spend someone's money. And so the example I've been using for a while is, you go to a car dealer, you say, hey, what funds do you have to pay for this? You say, hey, I've got it, are you going to take a loan out? Are we going to finance this? What's your down payment going to look like? And you say, well, I've got a IRA that's got RMDs, and that's really where I get most of my income. They say, yeah, I think that's a good idea. We should spend that. Let's just pay off the car now. You got a big RMD coming. That's probably covered investment advice under the rule from just a legal standpoint. Now, the Department of Labor is not out there looking for that, but from a technical aspect, it's clearly investment advice under the rule. I think that's a scary proposition because it goes much further than we've ever seen this rule go in the past, and we're likely stuck with this aspect of it. I don't see this rolling back unless Congress gets involved, that they're actually going to have to undo this distribution aspect, because even if the rule were to be changed, a court at this point could actually say, yes, distributions would be a proper mechanism for investment advice under ERISA. So, that's without congressional change, that's probably still a reasonable concern to have, even if the rule is changed. And so some of this is just about wording when you're talking to somebody. And this includes attorneys, reverse mortgage specialists, anyone kind of talking about potentially covered assets, is not providing advice, but explaining something. And those are different. Kind of educational conversations and advice are two different things. So one is saying, like, you should roll over or you should take a distribution to pay for this. That's investment advice. But if you instead explained what would happen if you did something, right? You explain the tax implications of doing something, that's probably not investment advice, right? Explaining what would happen if you did something and telling somebody to do something are very different things. Now, again, if most of this is oral and nothing's being written, put it in emails, right? It's always hard to track. That becomes an evidentiary issue in case there's any dispute. But be careful with wording, especially writing anything down that feels like advice, that you're telling somebody or recommending something on what to do. The next three here, I'm not going to cover. These are talking about RMDs from a plan, but this is pretty much the example I gave before about if you tell somebody to take money and then to spend it, that's most likely providing investment advice, especially if it's an ongoing payment too. So what about Social Security? I think Don wanted to jump in at some point here for Social Security. I'll give you a spot in a second. I just want to kind of give our overview of where we're sitting, and then we can have a little bit of a conversation. So current system, what's happening today? Social Security and Medicare are by far the largest expenditures of the United States government. You often hear that military is our largest expense. It's not even close. Social Security and Medicare are 42% of federal government expenditures. But why is that different? Well, these are actually funded through a specific payroll tax sent directly to fund these, right? So we actually tie up, right, these taxes for these benefits. Probably the way you should do things if you're going to spend at the government level is have everything kind of tied up to a specific tax. And I know people always say, actually, I'd like to see that. Where are my taxes going? Well, you actually know which of your taxes are going for Social Security and Medicare. And it's funded through our FICA and SECA taxes, SECA. Which is about 6.2% for Social Security and 1.45% for Medicare. Now, both of those are doubled if you are self-employed. So if you're working for an employer, your employer is paying half of it, which people often forget. That if you're kind of working for an employer, they're actually paying about 7.5% more than what you earn for Social Security and Medicare benefits. And so I think people kind of don't appreciate that aspect of their employer, that they are really paying this extra amount for them, which is, a nice employer benefit. Now, the combined trusts are expected to run out in 2034. Now, that's kind of government accounting, so it's not like there's actually all this money sitting in the trust, but kind of what the government's brought in, investment earnings, et cetera, they're kind of, this system would start losing money around 2034. Social Security System Fund is still growing today. I'll show you that. And then what are the potential changes? Well, we have to do something, in the next 15 years is really the answer. We can't just continue with the current demographics and system we have today, but we've known this for a long time. This is a change in demographics, that we are an aging country. We're going to have more and more seniors. The baby boomers are moving into retirement. We're not going to have enough workers to be funding the system. So we've got to do something else. And so is it changing full retirement age, pushing that up? Is it changing when you can retire from 62 to 64? Is it reducing benefits for certain people? Is it increasing the taxes to pay for this? And so what we see is about 44 million people get retirement benefits. We see about 61 million people overall get some type of Social Security benefit, about 171 million paying to the system in 2016. So most of, I think it's 90+% of American workers are now covered under Social Security. And the other thing I always like to bring up about Social Security is how efficient this system is. I'm a lover of the Social Security system here in the United States. The total overhead and administration costs of Social Security is 0.7%, right? think about that, right? And I think that this is often understated when people saying, "Oh, Social Security, it's such an inefficient system." I'm like, Social Security is the most efficient financial system in the world, right? At 0.7% overhead and administration, right? Imagine if you could run a company at 0.7% cost, right? That's astonishing how efficient the system is. Why? Because everyone's covered, right? It's an incredibly efficient system, and it actually runs very well today, right? There are problems, there's fraud issues, there are things that are an issue with the system. Nothing's perfect, but it's an amazingly efficient system out there. And that's why it can provide such a great benefit for people that a traditional insurance company can't ever get there. They've got marketing, they've got overhead, they've got additional losses that can occur. They just will never be able to get to this type of efficiency. They don't have to compete with anyone. You don't have to win the market share. You have it. You don't have selective buying. And so it's really fantastic in that point. And so hopefully it gets fixed. Now, again, technically the surplus, the peak of the trust fund should happen sometime around 2021 for the combined two, and then it goes quickly down by 2034. Now, my thought here is that we're not going to see anything fixed before 2021. Why? I can't name anything the government has fixed, 17 years before it broke. And if anyone can tell me about something, I'd love to hear it. Been asking this for years, and I don't think anyone's told me any. But I mean, we just don't fix things that quickly. So Social Security is probably just going to keep charging along as it is today. And here's kind of showing, this is the 2016. I pull some numbers every year. As you can see, actually, both the disability fund and the old age survivor insurance fund actually grew from the end of 2015 to 2016. That income was more than cost. So again, it's doing okay today, right? But it's on a trajectory to break, essentially. And then this is on this slide, it should be kind of a blue screen graph. And this actually shows the net long range actuarial deficit as a percentage of taxable payroll on how you would fix it, about 2.83%. And so this one is kind of what would we have to raise taxes by to just fix the system. This does start to go up every year, though. So this is a concerning point that if you fixed it today, it's going to be a low amount. It was about 2.6 2 years ago, and it's creeped up to 2.8. So it gets more and more expensive to fix the system the longer we wait. So the sooner we fix it, the better it's going to be, the cheaper it's going to be. So in some sense, it would be great to fix it. That still feels palatable, right? Could we survive a 2.83% tax increase to totally fix Social Security for the next 85 years? Sure, I think most people would agree with that, that's probably doable. But again, that's going to get worse and worse as we go. And then the funds will be depleted sometime 2034. What happens then? About a 25% cut to benefits. We saw some changes in 2016 that removed some of the file and suspend strategies in a hope to reduce down some of the debt obligations. They're very minor, though, honestly, for the system. They didn't have a huge impact on the trustee report. But those are all implemented at this point, at least the file and suspend. There is a restricted filing aspect, which is going to kind of be phased out, I guess, over, 8 years, probably to 2023, will be 2023, 2022, somewhere in that time frame. The last change will be phased in from the 2015 legislation. So Don, I guess, did you want to ask a question here? I know you told me before you wanted to hop in for a second.
I do want to ask the question, Jamie, but I want to. Social Security came up, I guess, a week and a half ago. This Consumer Finance Protection Bureau had a white paper or an article about using reverse mortgages to defer Social Security, and I was encouraged by the article, not by its content, but the two things. One, that they were highlighting the use of the strategy, which little people were implementing it. Secondly, they shared with many advisors didn't know reverse mortgages could even be used for. And so I was grateful for that. You wrote an excellent response to that in Forbes, and somewhere I'd like you to respond to that uh, because next week Dr. Tom
Yeah.
Davidson will be speaking about it. But could you respond to that, and then we'll open up for some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually saw you. I think you posted a little video about that, and I was like, why is Don like this report, right? And I think that's true, right? That not enough people know about kind of effective uses of reverse mortgages coordinated with other financial planning decisions, and so this was one of them for many years that Wade and myself and other people have talked about. Now, to be honest, there's not a whole lot of academic research on this topic, which is, something that's a little unfortunate because CFPB basically now has the outstanding report on this, which is just kind of fraught with errors, and probably from just a fundamental financial analysis thing. I think this is the one that still bothers me the most is that in the report they compare the present value benefits of deferring Social Security to the future value costs of using a reverse mortgage at different ages. And then they say, hey, look, this is a bad deal. Well, I almost wanted to call them up and say, hey, I've got a great deal for you then, right? You give me, right, $1 million today. I'm going to give you $1 million dollars and $10 in 50 years from now, right? It's going to be a great deal for you, right? Because you get more money in the future than you paid out today. That's basically what the report says, which is nonsense, right? You can't compare present and future values together. And that's really what they did, which is unfortunate because it's, as I said before, actually, if that was a freshman finance paper you turned in, the professor would fail you. You couldn't pass a class with that, and yet the CFPB rolled this out. Which was very clear. They actually opened by saying the reason that they did this was to dissuade people from using this strategy. They said they were concerned about more people using it. And as you said, very few people knew this strategy existed or used it. I actually am not sure, if it even registers. I said quick use of my math said at maximum, if everyone who is taking a reverse mortgage kind of to do this and everyone that was deferring Social Security were the same people, that you could probably find about 0.1% to 0.2% of the population that were doing this. And that would be considering everyone using a reverse mortgage at that age was doing it, which is clearly not true either. I bet it's probably less than 1% of that, meaning it's probably something like 0.01% or less of the American populations ever use this strategy. So then it kind of begs, like, why would the CFPB attack a strategy that, really is used at a level that it doesn't even register on anything, right? We'd call that accounting dust. And then not only that, their conclusion is that you need to be wary of this strategy, but their report actually shows that it's a benefit if used correctly, even in their analysis, which I said is fairly flawed and actually kind of underestimates the benefit of the strategy. But even their test shows it can be used beneficially. So I actually kind of thought that the conclusion doesn't even line up with their analysis, that the conclusion should be this is an effective strategy, but must be used appropriately. That's the conclusion from their analysis, but they seem to have a predetermined desire to drive people away from it. But it did bring attention to it, right? As I said, I wrote an article for The Hill, which is actually a big CFPB fan in general, and then Forbes on this, and it's gotten some other traction out there. Investment News ran an article kind of criticizing the report in addition to some other ones. So it's definitely bringing some attention to reverse mortgages and kind of coordinating with other financial strategies, and I think that's very important.
Thank you, Jamie. The
Uh,
Go ahead.
Yeah, so as I say, if we want to, I know we're kind of getting towards the end. I can just give kind of two other pieces of thoughts that are out there, and then we can kind of wrap up. So one is kind of estate planning. Estate planning is really going to be tied to the tax reform. Will the federal estate tax get repealed? Another thing about that, it impacts what would you say, kind of roughly 2 out of every 1,000 estates. So when you look at that, it's a tiny percentage. Again, I think it's like the 0.2%, right, of the United States population. So not even the 1%ers. It's a small percentage of them that are subject to this. But the federal estate tax drives planning. And so, like from a revenue standpoint, it's minor. From an impact on individuals, it's minor. But what we know is when the federal estate tax went away, we had 1 year, kind of in the last decade where it was gone. Attorneys actually in the estate planning world, there was a survey. They said that their work dropped by about half that year, and very few of those people were subject to the federal estate tax. So to me, the real concern here is that removing the federal estate tax will probably cause people to plan less, and I think that's bad. I think from a public policy standpoint, this makes a lot of sense, even though it has almost no financial impact at this point from a large scale kind of decision making. It impacts people like the Walton family, Trump, the one, the top percent of the world, but not very many other people, but it still drives behavior. And then the last part is we should be watching out for state-run IRA programs. They're slowly coming into the fold. There was a federal MIRA program that's now been axed, as I said, but it looks like some states are going to jump into the ring and try to replace that at the state level, which is really for low-income individuals that don't have an employer-sponsored plan. So that's been moving forward this year. And so that's pretty much where we sit today on a lot of these topics. Obviously, there's things I didn't touch on, but I'll kick it over here to Don for a second to wrap up. But that's really everything I had. So I want to thank everyone for joining me. And Don, thank you for hosting these ongoing ones. Thank RFS, and definitely show up and watch. Tom Davison, the Dr. Tom Davison, next week, or next week, Don?
Yes, sir. Next week.
So yeah, definitely show up and watch him.
Jamie, thank you for that. And we want to take a few questions. That if you have a few, go ahead and write them in the question box. They'll take a few seconds to get over to us. And if not, we'll wait a second and see what shows up. And Jamie, I appreciate that. That was a tremendous kind of State of the Union, a one fell swoop covering a lot of different things there, and I greatly appreciate it. And a comment from Chris says, "You guys are rock stars." Thank you, Chris. And the ticket was free today. So usually when you see Bono and Sting together like this, costs you a little money. William says, "So is DOL dead, Jamie? In your opinion?"
So that's a great question. So the real teeth of the DOL is dead. The expanded class action lawsuits, that's going to be wiped out. But the expansion of what is investment advice, that's probably here to stay. Now, how you enforce that was really going to be through class action suits. But individuals will be able to sue their advisors for failing to adhere to that standard, but they won't kind of get what really encourages attorneys to jump into this is that idea that I can get 1,000 clients and go sue one of the big financial institutions, as opposed to just dealing with one client. So enforcement of this is really going to get pulled back. The expanded rule is probably going to stay, but then enforcement looks like it's kind of dead.
Great. Chuck just had a comment, said a wonderful and very informative webinar. Thank you, Chuck. If anyone has another question or two, fire it away. We'll give it 60 more seconds, and then we'll wrap it up. We'll land the plane, and we'll send Jamie on his way. All right, 30 seconds and counting. And Jamie, it's been a great time with you as well. My friend from Seattle, who usually cheers the Seahawks, was on, so she wanted to let me know she's on the line. And always, these people who have Super Bowl type of things always feel some kind of way. Well, Jamie, we're going to stop and land the plane right here. Any concluding thoughts before I end the recording?
No, just thank you again. Thank RFS, and keep up the good work with these ongoing webinars. And definitely watch Tom talking about the kind of Social Security and other aspects next week.
Great. Hey, folks, this is Don Graves with Jamie Hopkins, the Financial State of the Union. We'll talk to you next time. Bye now. Thanks, Jamie.